I'm Betty, 38 female. I live a quiet life in a small apartment in the city, a place I chose for its proximity to the historical society where I work as an archivist. My days are spent surrounded by the past, brittle papers, faded photographs, and the silent stories of people long gone. It's a methodical, predictable existence, and I've always found comfort in that. My life was a stark contrast to my younger sister, Tiffany, who lived a life broadcasted for the world to see, and to our father, Arthur, who lived and died on the sprawling, debt-ridden family land he prized above all else. For years, I was the responsible one, the one who managed his accounts, scheduled his appointments, and made sure the crumbling farmhouse didn't completely fall apart, while my sister collected likes and sponsorships. I thought my quiet devotion meant something. I was wrong. This is the story of how my father's ultimate betrayal, meant to break me, ended up unearthing a secret buried for a century. A secret that would not only save me, but would also ensure my sister finally understood the true meaning of value. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. My relationship with my father, Arthur, was built on a foundation of unspoken duty. He wasn't a man given to open affection. His love was measured in acres of land and the sweat of his brow. He was a farmer, and the land was his legacy, his religion, his everything. From the time I was a little girl, I understood my role. I was the practical one, the steady hand. While my sister Tiffany was chasing butterflies, I was learning to balance a ledger. While she was practicing her pageant wave in the mirror, I was figuring out how to file tax extensions for the farm. She was the beautiful, charming one, the one Dad showed off to his friends. I was the reliable one, the one he called when the power went out or when he couldn't figure out the new online banking portal. For the last 10 years of his life, this dynamic hardened into a rigid routine. I lived 2 hours away in the city, but every other weekend, I would make the drive back to the old farmhouse. The journey itself felt like traveling back in time. The highways would narrow into country roads, flanked by tilting telephone poles and fields of corn that stretched to the horizon. The house stood on a small hill, a 2-story colonial that had seen better days. Its white paint was peeling in long strips, the porch sagged, and a few shingles were always missing from the roof, giving it a permanently disheveled look. Dad refused to spend a dime on what he called cosmetic nonsense. Every dollar had to go back into the farm, a farm that was barely breaking even. He was land-rich and cash-poor, a fact that was a constant, low-level hum of anxiety in my life. I'd arrive on a Friday evening, and the work would begin. I'd sort through the mountain of bills on his kitchen table, separating the urgent from the merely overdue. I'd create grocery lists, cook meals he could freeze and reheat, and clean the layers of dust that seemed to settle the moment my back was turned. He'd sit in his worn leather armchair, watching a game on his ancient television, occasionally grunting a thank you or asking where I'd put the remote. Tiffany, on the other hand, would visit maybe twice a year, usually on a major holiday. She'd de-sweep in like a whirlwind of perfume and designer clothes, snap a few dozen photos for her lifestyle blog, captioned with things like country living family first, and then disappear just as quickly, citing a brand collaboration or a networking event she couldn't miss. She never lifted a finger to help. Cleaning was bad for her manicure, and finances gave her a headache. Dad never seemed to mind. He would beam with pride as she recounted her latest adventures, her follower count, her trivial dramas. To him, her life was exciting, a success story he could brag about. My life, my steady job as an archivist, my quiet, responsible existence, that was just Betty being Betty. Expected, unremarkable. I once tried to explain to him the historical significance of a collection of Civil War letters I was preserving. He'd listened with a vacant expression and then asked if I'd remembered to pick up his heart medication. I stopped trying after that. My currency in the family was my usefulness, nothing more. I was the engine room operator of our family ship, unseen and unheard, while Tiffany was the glamorous figurehead on the prow. The mortgage on the farm was a constant source of stress. Dad had refinanced it multiple times over the years to buy new equipment or cover a bad harvest. The debt loomed over us, a dark cloud on the sunniest of days. I had tried, gently, to suggest he sell off a small parcel of the land, a back 40 that was mostly woods, to ease the fina. Ensile pressure. He had reacted as if I'd suggested he sell a child. "You don't sell land, Betty," he'd said, his voice hard as granite. "It's who we are, it's all we are." Yet he never hesitated to ask me for money when things got tight. I'd dip into my own savings, sending him a few $100s here, 1,000 there to cover a bill or an unexpected repair. He never called them loans, he called them helping out. I knew I would never see a cent of it again. It was my duty. It was just what I did. I never complained. I loved him in my own quiet way, and I felt a fierce, protective loyalty to the very land that was draining us dry. I saw it not as a failing business, but as our history, our roots. I suppose, in that way, I was more my father's daughter than I ever realized. I just showed my love through spreadsheets and balanced budgets, not through stubborn pride. The last time I saw him alive was on one of those routine weekends. He seemed more tired than usual, his movements slower, his breath a little shorter. I patched a leaky pipe under the kitchen sink, paid the electric bill online, and left him with 7 labeled and dated freezer meals. As I was leaving, he stopped me on the porch. "You're a good girl, Betty," he said, patting my arm awkwardly. It was a rare, almost shocking display of acknowledgement. For a fleeting moment, I felt a warmth spread through my chest. I thought maybe he does see, maybe he does understand. That was the last thing he ever said to me. 2 weeks later, he had a massive heart attack while mending a fence. He was gone before the paramedics could arrive. The days following my father's death were a blur of logistics and grief. It was me, of course, who made the arrangements. I called the funeral home, wrote the obituary, and fielded calls from distant relatives. Tiffany flew in from a wellness retreat in Bali, arriving 24 hours late, her face a mask of performative sorrow. She posted a black and white photo of her and Dad from her childhood, the caption a long, rambling tribute that was more about her own feelings of loss than it was about the man himself. It got over 50,000 likes. In person, she was less poetic. "Can you believe this?" she whispered to me as we stood in the funeral home, picking out a casket. "I had a sponsored post for a new energy drink scheduled for tomorrow. This is going to totally mess up my content calendar." I just stared at her, a cold, hollow feeling spreading through my chest. I said nothing. Arguing with Tiffany was like trying to punch smoke. It was pointless and left you feeling foolish. The funeral was a modest affair, attended by a handful of aging neighbors and family friends. Tiffany cried, loud and theatrical, while I stood stoic, a single tear tracing a path down my cheek. My grief was a quiet, heavy thing, a stone in my gut. I felt not just the loss of my father, but the loss of any hope that he might, one day, truly see me. The awkward pat on my arm during my last visit was the only crumb of affection I had to cling to, and it felt pitifully small. A week later, we found ourselves in the stuffy, wood-paneled office of Mr. Davies, our father's lawyer for over 40 years. The office smelled of old paper and stale coffee. Mr. Davies, a kindly man with a weary face, peered at us over his spectacles. "Thank you both for coming," he said, his voice gentle. "I have Arthur's last will and testament here. He was very specific about his instructions." Tiffany sat forward in her chair, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. I simply sat still, my hands folded in my lap, bracing myself. I wasn't expecting much. I assumed he'd split things equally, or perhaps leave the land jointly in our names. It was the fair thing to do, and despite his favoritism, I thought my father was, at his core, a fair man. Mr. Davies cleared his throat and began to read. The legal jargon washed over me until he got to the main bequests. "To my beloved daughter, Tiffany," he read, his voice wavering slightly, "in recognition of the joy and light she brought into my life, I leave my entire financial estate. This includes all savings accounts, checking accounts, investment portfolios, and the life insurance policy, totaling approximately $750,000. My breath hitched in my throat. $750,000. I thought of the countless times I had transferred money from my meager savings to his account to keep the lights on. I thought of the weekends I had given up, the vacations I had never taken. Tiffany let out a small, dramatic gasp, her hand flying to her chest. A real tear, a tear of genuine shock and delight, finally rolled down her cheek. Mr. Davies continued, his eyes now fixed on the document, as if he couldn't bear to look at me. "To my daughter, Betty," he read, and my entire body tensed. "In recognition of her practical nature and her deep connection to our family's history, I leave the family home and all associated land, encompassing the full 300 acres of the Blackwood Creek property." For a split second, a wave of relief washed over me. The land. He left me the land. The thing he valued most. But the relief was short-lived. Mr. Davies took a deep breath before delivering the final blow. "This bequest is, of course, subject to the outstanding mortgage and all associated debts against the property, which are to become her sole responsibility." He paused, then looked at me with an expression of profound pity. "Betty," he said softly, "the current mortgage on the property is approximately $380,000. Given the condition of the house and the low yield of the farm, the property's assessed value is only slightly more than that. I'm so sorry." The air left my lungs. It felt like a physical punch. He hadn't left me the land. He had left me a crushing, insurmountable debt. He had left Tiffany a fresh start, a life of ease and comfort, and he had left me his burdens. His final act was to chain me to the very thing that had drained him his entire life. Tiffany, after a moment of feigned sympathy for me, was already on her phone, no doubt calculating how quickly she could move the money into a high-yield account. I stood in stony silence. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt a profound, chilling emptiness. It wasn't about the money. It was the message behind it. It was his final, undeniable statement on our respective worth. Tiffany was the treasure to be rewarded. I was the caretaker to be saddled with the mess. "Is that everything, Mr. Davies?" I asked, my voice eerily calm. He nodded somberly. "Yes, Betty, that's everything." Tiffany looked up from her phone. "Well, I guess you'll have to sell, right? I mean, you can't possibly afford this place. Maybe you can get enough to pay off the bank and have a little left over. I could give you the number of a good realtor." Her tone wasn't malicious. It was worse. It was dismissive, as if she were giving advice on how to get rid of a stained sofa. I looked at her, then at Mr. Davies. I took the thick manila envelope containing the deed and the will, my movements stiff and robotic. "Thank you for your time," I said, turning and walking out of the office without a backward glance. The silence in the car on the way back to the farmhouse was absolute. The weight of his will, his final judgment, was suffocating. He had finally broken me, or so he thought. The first week after the will reading was a study in misery. I stayed at the farmhouse, unable to face my own apartment in the city. The house, which had always felt like a part of my history, now felt like a prison. Every creaking floorboard, every rattling window, sounded like a taunt. The mortgage payment was due in 3 weeks, a colossal sum I had no way of paying. The bank had already sent a letter, a coldly polite reminder of the debt that now bore my name. Tiffany, true to form, had called once. She didn't offer help, of course. Instead, she spent 20 minutes talking about the amazing financial advisor she had hired and her plans to invest in a luxury condo. "You really should consider selling, Betty," she'd said, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "You could get a cute little apartment. It would be so much more manageable for you." I hung up mid-sentence. I spent my days in a daze, wandering from room to room, touching the worn furniture, breathing in the scent of dust and old wood. I was surrounded by my father's life, and all I could feel was the crushing weight of his disregard. I was drowning in the legacy he had cursed me with. On the 5th day, I decided I couldn't just sit there and wait for the foreclosure notice. If I was going to lose the house, I would at least do it on my own terms. I needed to sort through a lifetime of accumulated possessions to separate the trash from the treasure, though at that point, it all felt like trash to me. I started in my father's study, a small, cluttered room at the back of the house. It was a place I had rarely entered. It was his sanctuary, filled with stacks of farming almanacs, dusty trophies from his youth, and boxes of papers he deemed important. It was a mess, and the task felt overwhelming. I began with the desk, sorting through drawers filled with dried-out pens, old receipts, and tangled paperclips. It was tedious, soul-crushing work. In the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of old tax returns, I found a small, locked metal box. It was heavy and old, the kind of strongbox people used before home safes were common. I recognized it from my childhood. Dad always kept it in his desk, but I never knew what was inside. I assumed it held important documents, maybe old savings bonds or his military papers. I spent an hour trying to find the key before giving up and heading to the shed to get a hammer and a crowbar. With a few sharp blows, the old lock gave way. I lifted the lid, my heart pounding with a strange mix of dread and curiosity. Inside, there was no treasure. There were no stock certificates, no bundles of cash. There was just a thick stack of yellowed documents, tied together with a faded red ribbon. They were old, much older than I expected. The paper was brittle, and the ink was faded to a pale brown. At the very top of the stack was the original land grant for the property, dated 1888, signed by the governor of the state. It granted the land to my great-great-grandfather, a man named Silas Miller. As an archivist, I felt a familiar thrill. This was history, my history. I carefully untied the ribbon and began to leaf through the papers. There were deeds, property tax records from the 1920s, and a hand-drawn map of the original property lines. Then I saw it. Tucked in the middle of the stack was a separate document, an addendum to the original grant. It was written in the same elaborate, spidery script. It was a formal transfer of rights. I read the words slowly, my lips moving silently. "And with this parcel of land," it said, "are hereby granted in perpetuity all rights to the minerals, ores, and valuable stones contained within said land, to Silas Miller and his heirs forevermore." I stared at the sentence, reading it again and again. Mineral rights. My father had never, not once, mentioned mineral rights. As far as I knew, our land was good for one thing, growing corn at a barely profitable margin. It was just dirt. But this document suggested otherwise. I carefully examined the papers again. I found the original survey maps, which were far more detailed than the modern ones I was used to. They marked the location of Blackwood Creek, the old oak tree on the ridge, and something else, a small, hand-drawn symbol near the northern edge of the property, labeled simply vein. It was dismissed with a note in the margin: quartz and mica deposits, non-arable land. To a farmer in 1888, that meant it was useless. Quartz and mica were common, worthless, but geology was not a static science. What was considered worthless then might not be now. A tiny flicker of something, not yet hope, but a defiant spark of curiosity ignited within me. Could this be real, or was it just the wishful thinking of a desperate woman? I remembered my father scoffing at the idea of selling the useless, wooded back 40. That was the northern edge of the property, the non-arable land. He had no idea. He had sat on this box his entire life, guarding what he thought was just a pile of dirt and debt, completely oblivious to the secret it held. He was so fixated on the surface, on the crops he could see and touch, that he never bothered to look deeper. I carefully placed the documents back in the box. The weight of the house, of the mortgage, still pressed down on me, but it felt different now. It was no longer the weight of a tombstone. It felt like the weight of a locked door, and I had just found the key. My father, in his final, dismissive act, had handed me a dilapidated house and a mountain of debt. But in his ignorance, in his complete lack of curiosity about the history he claimed to cherish, he had also handed me a lottery ticket. He had left me the one thing he never knew he had. For the first time since he died, I didn't feel broken. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a clarity of purpose. My training as an archivist, the very thing he considered a dull and useless profession, had prepared me for this exact moment. I knew how to read old documents. I knew how to follow a paper trail. And I was about to follow this one all the way down. The discovery of the mineral rights document transformed my grief into a quiet, focused energy. The dusty farmhouse no longer felt like a prison, but a headquarters. The first thing I did was scan every single page from the metal box, creating high-resolution digital copies. My archivist instincts were screaming at me to protect the originals at all costs. These brittle pages were my only ammunition. My next step was to understand what quartz and mica deposits really meant in a modern context. My knowledge of geology was limited to what I'd learned in a high school science class. I needed an expert, someone who could translate the language of the land for me. I spent a full day researching geologists in the state, looking for someone with expertise in mineral assessments, preferably an independent consultant who wouldn't have ties to any major mining corporations. I found him on the third page of my search results. Mark Jennings, a geologist with over 20 years of experience who ran a small consulting firm out of a nearby city. His website was simple, professional, and listed rare earth mineral and gemstone surveys as one of his specialties. He seemed perfect. Calling him was one of the most nerve-wracking things I'd ever done. My hand trembled as I dialed the number. What if he thought I was a crackpot? What if this was all a wild goose chase based on a 140-year-old note in a margin? A calm, deep voice answered on the second ring. Mark Jennings. I took a breath and explained my situation, trying to sound as rational and professional as possible. I told him about the property, the inheritance, and the old documents. I described the addendum about the mineral rights and the surveyor's note about quartz and mica. I expected him to be dismissive, but he listened patiently, asking sharp, intelligent questions. And the note specified the northern parcel? He asked. Near Blackwood Creek? Yes, that's right, I replied. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Ms. Miller, he said, his voice now tinged with a new level of interest. Certain types of pegmatite, which often present as quartz and mica formations, can be sources for minerals that were considered worthless a century ago but are highly valuable today. Things like tourmaline, beryl, or even spodumene, which is a primary source of lithium. Lithium, the word hung in the air. I knew what lithium was. It was in batteries, in phones, in electric cars. It was the white gold of the 21st century. Could you come and take a look? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I can pay for your time. I'll be there tomorrow at 10, he said, and I could hear the genuine curiosity in his voice. No charge for the initial site visit. Consider it professional curiosity. Mark arrived the next morning, driving a dusty pickup truck that looked like it had seen its share of rough terrain. He was a man in his mid-40s, with a weathered face, kind eyes, and a firm handshake. He looked more like a farmer than a scientist, and I immediately felt at ease. I showed him the documents first, spreading them carefully across the kitchen table. He studied them with a magnifying glass, his brow furrowed in concentration. This is incredible, he murmured, looking at the mineral rights addendum. This is an ironclad, perpetual grant. Your family doesn't just own the land, they own everything down to the center of the earth. They don't make them like this anymore. We then spent the next 4 hours hiking the property. We headed to the back 40, the wooded, rocky area my father had always ignored. Mark carried a geological hammer and a bag of equipment. He moved with a practiced ease, his eyes scanning the ground, the rock outcroppings, the creek bed. I pointed out the spot where the old survey map had marked the vein. It was a series of rocky ledges, covered in moss and tangled vines. Mark got to work. He chipped away at the rocks, examined the crystals embedded within them, and took samples. He was mostly silent, completely absorbed in his work. I just watched, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. Finally, after examining a large, pale green crystal he had pried from an outcrop near the creek, he stood up, holding it in the palm of his hand. He looked at me, and a slow grin spread across his face. "Betty," he said, his voice filled with something that sounded like awe. "This isn't just quartz and mica, this is a massive pegmatite dike. And this," he said, holding up the greenish crystal, "is spodumene." My mind raced to catch up. "The lithium?" "The lithium," he confirmed, nodding, "and look at this." He pointed to some dark, almost black crystals in another rock. "Tourmaline, and not just any tourmaline. Based on this formation, I'd wager we could find some high-quality, gem-grade specimens here. The old surveyor saw worthless rock because he didn't have the tools or the knowledge to see what was really here. He saw what he expected to see." We walked back to the house in a daze. Mark explained that to know the full extent and value, we would need to conduct a core sampling survey, a much more involved and expensive process. But his preliminary, expert opinion was that I was sitting on one of the most significant untapped mineral deposits in the state. He estimated the potential value not in the thousands or even hundreds of thousands, but in the millions. potentially tens of millions. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had sorted my father's bills, and felt the world tilt on its axis. The debt that was meant to crush me was a pittance. The dilapidated house was a palace. The worthless land my father had cursed me with was a treasure chest, and he had handed me the only key. A wave of bitter irony washed over me. My father, who valued wealth and success above all, had completely overlooked the fortune under his own feet. And my sister, who had just inherited what she thought was the entirety of his wealth, had been given the pocket change. The game had changed, and I was the only one who knew the new rules. The knowledge of my newfound wealth was a secret I guarded with ferocious intensity. It was a fragile, glowing ember that I had to protect from the winds of my sister's greed and the world's prying eyes. For the next 2 months, I lived a double life. To the outside world, I was the poor, dutiful daughter, struggling to deal with the fallout of a cruel inheritance. I let the narrative Tiffany was surely spinning to her friends and followers, that of her poor, overwhelmed sister trapped in a money pit, run its course. I even played the part. When the first mortgage payment came due, I called the bank and, using a portion of my own savings, paid it. When the property tax bill arrived, I paid that too. I needed to establish a pattern of behavior that showed I was taking on the burden, making it my own. Every dollar I spent felt like an investment in the final outcome. I was building a foundation of silence and sacrifice, a stage upon which the final act would play out. Meanwhile, my secret life was a whirlwind of activity. I hired Mark Jennings and his small team to conduct a full geological survey. To avoid raising suspicion among the neighbors, we fabricated a cover story. Mark's team were university researchers studying water tables and soil composition for an environmental project. Their drilling rig, brought in under the cover of darkness, was explained away as equipment for taking soil samples. It was an expensive gamble. The survey cost nearly $80,000, a sum that consumed almost every penny of my life savings and required me to take out a personal loan. It was terrifying, writing those checks, watching my safety net evaporate. But every preliminary report from Mark fueled my resolve. "The spodumene deposits are even richer than I initially thought, Betty," he'd tell me over the phone, his voice buzzing with excitement. "And we've confirmed gem-grade tourmaline and beryl. This is a significant find, a life-changing find." While Mark's team was drilling into the earth, I was drilling into the law. I hired a lawyer, not a local one, but a sharp, discreet attorney from a top firm in the state capital who specialized in mineral rights and corporate law. Her name was Eleanor Vance, and she was exactly who I needed: meticulous, unflappable, and utterly ruthless. I paid her a hefty retainer, another terrifying expense. In her gleaming high-rise office, I laid out the whole story: the will, the debt, the documents in the metal box, and Mark's preliminary findings. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she took off her glasses and looked me straight in the eye. "Ms. Miller," she said, "your father's will is a legal nightmare, but his ignorance is your golden ticket. The mineral rights are yours, exclusively. Your sister has no claim. Our first step is to protect this asset before it becomes public knowledge." Following Eleanor's advice, I took a series of quiet, strategic steps. We formed a limited liability company, or LLC, with a generic, forgettable name like Midstate Holdings. We then legally transferred the deed of the property, including the perpetual mineral rights, from my name into the name of the LLC. On paper, I was no longer the owner of the land. I was simply the managing director of the company that owned it. It was a layer of legal insulation, a firewall to protect the asset from any future claims or challenges. Eleanor explained it was crucial that Tiffany believed I was personally drowning in the farm's debt. If she thought I was struggling, she would leave me alone. If she suspected I had found something valuable, she would descend like a vulture. My days were consumed by this secret project. I continued my work at the Historical Society, the quiet, methodical tasks of archiving a soothing counterpoint to the high-stakes maneuvering of my other life. I drove out to the farm on weekends, not to clean, but to check on the survey team's progress. I learned to read core samples, to differentiate pegmatite from granite, to understand the language of assays and yields. The land was no longer just a piece of my family's history. It was a living, breathing entity, and I was finally learning its secrets. During this time, Tiffany's calls became less frequent. She was busy living her new life. Her social media was a parade of luxury travel, designer shopping sprees, and lavish parties. She had bought the condo she wanted, a sleek, glass-walled monstrosity downtown, and was spending a fortune on renovations. In one of our last brief conversations, she'd mentioned, with a hint of impatience, that the money was going faster than she'd expected. "It's insane how much a custom Italian marble countertop costs," she'd sighed, as if it were a profound burden. She asked how I was doing with the money pit. I told her it was a struggle, that I was barely keeping my head above water. "Well, I told you to sell," she'd said, her sympathy as thin as onion skin. "You were always too sentimental, Betty." That was the last time we spoke before the survey was complete. The final report landed on my lawyer's desk like a bombshell. Mark's most optimistic projections had been conservative. The land held an estimated $90 million worth of lithium and a further 10 to 15 million in gem-grade tourmaline. My quiet revolution was about to become very loud. The plan was in place. The assets were secured. Now, all that was left was to let my sister know that the debt she thought I was drowning in was about to become her problem. The final phase of the plan began with a simple, legally required letter. After months of making the mortgage payments myself, establishing a clear pattern of financial responsibility for the property, I stopped. I let the next payment deadline pass. As expected, the bank's letters began to arrive, first polite reminders, then more insistent demands, and finally, a formal notice of intent to foreclose. These letters were, of course, addressed to me as the inheritor of the property. But legally, the property was now owned by Midstate Holdings, LLC. I, Betty Miller, the individual, was simply the person who had inherited the debt attached to it. It was a subtle but crucial distinction that a leaner Vance had drilled into me. The debt followed the person named in the will, while the asset had been legally insulated. The next step was a strategic visit to Mr. Davies, the old family lawyer. I walked into his office looking exactly as he would expect, tired, stressed, and defeated. I showed him the foreclosure notice from the bank. "Mr. Davies," I said, my voice carefully modulated to sound weary. "I can't do it. I've tried. I've used all my savings, but the mortgage is just too much. I'm going to have to let the bank take the property." He looked at me with genuine pity. "Oh, Betty, I'm so sorry to hear that. It's a terrible shame after all the years your family has owned that land." "I know," I said, looking down at my hands. "But there's another problem. The will. It says Tiffany gets all the financial assets and I get the land and its debts. If the bank forecloses, they'll sell the property at auction. If the sale price is less than the mortgage owed, and you and I both know it will be, the bank will come after the estate for the difference. The deficiency judgment, I think it's called." I watched as the legal implications dawned on his face. His eyes widened slightly. "Yes," he said slowly. "The bank has a claim against the estate's total assets to cover any outstanding debt. The estate hasn't been fully closed yet." "Exactly," I said. "And the estate's primary financial assets are the $750,000 Dad left to Tiffany. If the farm is foreclosed on, the bank is going to come after her inheritance to cover the shortfall." I let that sink in. I had, through my lawyer, confirmed this with the bank. The loan was secured by the property, but the obligation was tied to the estate until all debts were settled. As executor, Mr. Davies had a fiduciary duty to inform the primary beneficiary of any potential claims against her inheritance. I had just handed him a ticking time bomb. "I'll have to call Tiffany," he murmured, already looking pale. "Of course," I said. "It's only right that she knows." I left his office and drove away, my heart beating a steady, triumphant rhythm. The trap was set. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Tiffany. She didn't bother with a greeting. "What is this I hear from Mr. Davies?" she shrieked. "He's saying the bank can take my money because you're not paying the mortgage on that stupid farm? You can't let them do that, Betty. That's my money." "Hello, Tiffany," I said calmly. "Yes, it's a difficult situation. I just can't afford the payments anymore." Then sell it. I told you to sell it months ago, she yelled. I've tried, I lied smoothly. No one wants it. The house is a teardown and the land isn't worth the mortgage. The best offer I got was $200,000, which would still leave a massive shortfall for the bank to collect from you. This is your fault, she screamed. You inherited the stupid place. You're supposed to handle it. I inherited the debt, Tiffany, I replied, my voice cold and clear. You inherited the cash. It seems Dad's final wishes have tied us together in a way he probably didn't anticipate. There was a sputtering silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, the panic rising. Her entire world of luxury condos and designer clothes was under threat. What do I do? She finally asked, her voice small and desperate. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Well, I said, feigning reluctance. There is one option. You could pay off the mortgage, all of it. Use a portion of your inheritance to clear the debt. That would satisfy the bank, close the estate, and protect the rest of your money. Then the property would be free and clear. Pay it off. That's almost $400,000. Half my inheritance, she cried. It's either that, or risk the bank taking a chunk of it anyway after a messy foreclosure, plus legal fees, I said simply. And you know how lawyers are, it's your choice. I gave her the bank's information and hung up. The next 48 hours were the longest of my life. Had I pushed too hard? Would she call my bluff? But I knew my sister. The fear of losing her money, her lifestyle, would be far more powerful than any other consideration. On the third day, I received an email from the bank. It was a formal notification. The mortgage on the Blackwood Creek property, loan number 743B9, had been paid in full. A zero balance. Tiffany had done it. She had used nearly half of her joy and light inheritance to pay off the debt on the worthless land my father had left me. She had, in effect, just paid me $380,000 to take a multi-million-dollar property off her hands. The quietest revolution was over. I had won. The satisfaction of that victory was deep and profound. It wasn't a gloating, triumphant feeling. It was a quiet, solid sense of justice. My father had tried to saddle me with a burden, and Tiffany had been forced to lift it. The scales, for the first time in my life, felt balanced. With the property now owned free and clear by my LLC, and with the geological survey providing undeniable proof of its value, the final pieces of my new life began to fall into place. Eleanor Vance, my brilliant lawyer, helped me navigate the next steps. We didn't sell the land outright. Instead, we negotiated a long-term leasing agreement with a major, environmentally conscious mining corporation. It was a multi-million-dollar deal that provided me with a substantial upfront payment and, more importantly, ongoing royalties from every ton of lithium and every gemstone extracted from the ground. It was a stream of income that would last for generations. The contract was filled with clauses I insisted upon: strict environmental protections, land reclamation guarantees, and a commitment to hiring locally to benefit the community. I wasn't just getting rich, I was building a legacy, but one based on responsible stewardship, not stubborn pride. My life changed almost overnight, but not in the ways Tiffany might have imagined. I didn't buy a mansion or a sports car. The first thing I did was resign from my job at the Historical Society, not because I didn't love it, but because I now had the freedom to pursue my passion on my own terms. I established a charitable foundation, the Miller Family Archives, dedicated to preserving local history. I bought an old, beautiful building downtown and began renovating it into a state-of-the-art archival center, a place where the stories of our community could be protected and shared. I also invested in the old farmhouse. I hired the best architects and builders, not to tear it down, but to restore it to its former glory. The peeling paint was stripped away, the sagging porch was rebuilt, and the roof was replaced. Inside, the plumbing and wiring were modernized, but the old wooden floors, the stone fireplace, and the historic character were lovingly preserved. It was no longer a monument to my father's neglect, but a testament to my resilience. It became my home, a place of peace and quiet strength. As for Tiffany, her world began to shrink. With nearly half her inheritance gone and her lavish spending habits unchanged, her remaining funds dwindled faster than she could have imagined. Her lifestyle blog started to look less aspirational and more desperate. The luxury trips were replaced by local getaways. The designer hauls became thrifting adventures. She had to sell her glass-walled condo and move into a much smaller apartment. We never spoke of the mortgage again. In her mind, she had been forced to clean up my mess, a final, expensive act of sisterly duty. She had no idea that her mess was the foundation of my fortune. She drove past the renovated farmhouse once, slowing down to stare at the flurry of construction. I was outside, speaking with the landscape architect. She didn't stop. She just looked at me with a confused, resentful expression and drove away. That was the last time I saw her. I never felt the need to tell her the truth. The revenge was not in her knowing what she had lost, but in my knowing what I had gained. Her ignorance was a part of the justice. She had spent her life chasing a superficial, fleeting form of value, likes, followers, brand deals. She couldn't comprehend the true, hidden value that lay buried beneath the earth, the kind of value that required patience, knowledge, and a willingness to look deeper. She had received cash, and I had received a legacy. In the end, my father did leave me the most valuable thing, just not in the way he intended. He left me a problem to solve, a puzzle to unlock. In forcing me to fight for my own survival, he gave me a strength I never knew I had. In saddling me with the land he misunderstood, he gave me a future he couldn't have imagined. I often sit on the newly rebuilt porch of my old new home, looking out over the rolling hills, the same hills my great-great-grandfather first claimed. The land is peaceful, healing. The distant hum of the mining operation on the northern ridge is a quiet reminder of the secrets the earth holds. My father thought he was leaving me in the past, chained to a decaying history. But he was wrong. He was just the one who, unknowingly, finally handed me the key to my future. And I am sowing seeds he never would have known how to plant.